Chapter 21. On the surface of Magrathea, Arthur wandered about moodily. Ford had thoughtfully left him his copy of The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy to while away the time with. He pushed a few buttons at random. The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy is a very unevenly edited book, and contains many passages that simply seemed to its editors like a good idea at the time. One of these, the one Arthur now came across, supposedly relates to the experiences of one TheHitchhikerGuideToTheGalaxy, a quiet young student at the University of Maximegalon who pursued a brilliant academic career studying ancient philosophy, transformational ethics, and the wave harmonic theory of historical perception. And then, after a night of drinking pan-galactic goggle blasters with Zaphod Beeblebrox, became increasingly obsessed with the problem of what had happened to all the biros he'd bought over the past few years. There followed a long period of painstaking research, during which he visited all the major centers of biro loss throughout the galaxy, and eventually came up with a quaint little theory which quite caught the public imagination at the time. Somewhere in the cosmos, he said, along with all the planets inhabited by humanoids, reptiloids, fishoids, walking treeoids, and super-intelligent shades of blue, there was also a planet entirely given over to biro life forms. And it was to this planet that unintended biros would make their way, slipping away quietly through wormholes in space to a world where they knew they could enjoy a uniquely biroid lifestyle, responding to highly biro-oriented stimuli and generally leading the biro equivalent of the good life. And as theories go, this was all very fine and pleasant, until TheHitchhikerGuideToTheGalaxy suddenly claimed to have found this planet, and to have worked there for a while driving a limousine for a family of cheap green retractables. Whereupon he was taken away, locked up, wrote a book, and was finally sent into tax exile, which is the usual fate reserved for those who are determined to make a fool of themselves in public. When one day an expedition was sent to the spatial coordinates that TheHitchhikerGuideToTheGalaxy had claimed for this planet, they discovered only a small asteroid inhabited by a solitary old man, who claimed repeatedly that nothing was true, though he was later discovered to be lying. There did, however, remain the question of both the mysterious 60,000 Alterian dollars paid yearly into his Brantisvogen bank account, and of course, Zaphod Beeblebrox's highly profitable second-hand biro business. Arthur read this and put the book down. The robot was still there, completely inert. Arthur got up and walked to the top of the crater. He walked around the crater. He watched two suns set magnificently over Magrathea. He went back down into the crater. He woke the robot up, because even a manically depressed robot is better to talk to than nobody. "Night's falling," he said. "Look, robot, the stars are coming out." From the heart of a dark nebula it is possible to see very few stars, and only very faintly, but they were there to be seen. The robot obediently looked at them, then looked back. "I know," he said. "Wretched, isn't it?" "But that sunset! I've never seen anything like it in my wildest dreams. Two suns! It was like mountains of fire boiling into space." "I've seen it," said Marvin. "It's rubbish." "We only ever had the one sun at home," persevered Arthur. "I came from a planet called Earth, you know." "I know," said Marvin. "You keep going on about it. It sounds awful." "Oh no, it was a beautiful place." "Did it have oceans?" "Oh yes," said Arthur with a sigh. "Great wide rolling oceans." "Can't bear oceans," said Marvin. "Tell me," inquired Arthur, "do you get on well with other robots?" "Hate them," said Marvin. "Where are you going?" Arthur couldn't bear it any more. He got up again. "I think I'll just take another walk," he said. "Don't blame you," said Marvin, and counted 597,000 million sheep before falling asleep again a second later. Arthur slapped his arms about him to try and get his circulation a little more enthusiastic about its job. He trudged back to the wall of the crater. Because the atmosphere was so thin, and because there was no moon, nightfall was very rapid, and it was by now very dark. Because of this, Arthur practically walked into the old man before he noticed him. Chapter 22. He was standing with his back to Arthur, watching the very last glimmers of light sink into blackness behind the horizon. He was tallish, elderly, and dressed in a single long grey robe. When he turned, his face was thin and distinguished, careworn but not unkind, the sort of face you would happily bank with. But he didn't turn yet. not even to react to Arthur's yelp of surprise. Eventually, the last rays of the sun had vanished completely, and he turned. His face was still illuminated from somewhere, and Arthur looked for the source of the light. He saw that a few yards away stood a small craft of some kind. A small hovercraft, Arthur guessed. It shed a dim pool of light around it. The man looked at Arthur. Sadly, it seemed. "You chose a cold night to visit our dead planet," he said. Who are you?" stammered Arthur. The man looked away. Again, a kind of sadness seemed to cross his face. "My name's not important," he said. He seemed to have something on his mind. Conversation was clearly something he felt he didn't have to rush at. Arthur felt awkward. You startled me," he said, lamely. The man looked round to him again and slightly raised his eyebrows. He said. I said you startled me." "Do not be alarmed. I will not harm you." Arthur frowned at him. "But you shot at us. There were missiles," he said. The man chuckled slightly. "An automatic system," he said, and gave a small sigh. "Ancient computers ranged in the bowels of the planet tick away the dark millennia, and the ages hang heavy on their dusty databanks. I think they take the occasional pot shot to relieve the monotony." He looked gravely at Arthur and said, "I'm a great fan of science, you know." "Oh, really?" said Arthur, who was beginning to find the man's curious, kindly manner disconcerting. "Oh, yes," said the old man, and simply stopped talking again. "Ah," said Arthur. He had an odd feeling of being like a man in the act of adultery, who is surprised when the woman's husband wanders into the room, changes his trousers, passes a few idle remarks about the weather, and leaves again. "You seem ill at ease," said the old man with polite concern. No. Well, yes. Actually, you see, we weren't really expecting to find anybody about, in fact. I sort of gathered that you were all dead or something." "Dead?" said the old man. "Gracious, no. We have but slept." "Slept?" said Arthur incredulously. "Yes, through the great economic recession, you see," said the old man, apparently unconcerned about whether Arthur understood a word he was talking about or not. Economic recession?" "Well, you see, 5 million years ago the galactic economy collapsed, and seeing that custom-made planets has something of a luxury commodity, you see." He paused and looked at Arthur. "You know we built planets, do you?" He looked solemnly. "Well, yes," said Arthur. "I'd sort of gathered." "Fascinating trade," said the old man, and a wistful look came into his eyes. "Doing the coastlines was always my favorite. Used to have endless fun doing the bits in fjords. So, anyway," he was trying to find his thread again. "The recession came, and we decided it would save us a lot of bother if we just slept through it. So we programmed the computers to revive us when it was all over." The man stifled a slight yawn and continued. "The computers were index-linked to the galactic stock market prices, you see, so that we'd all be revived when everybody else had rebuilt the economy enough to afford our rather expensive prices." Arthur, a regular Guardian reader, was deeply shocked by this. "That's a pretty unpleasant way to behave, isn't it?" "Is it?" asked the old man mildly. "Oh, I'm sorry, I'm a bit out of touch." He pointed down into the crater. "Is that robot yours?" he said. "No," came a thin metallic voice from the crater. "I'm mine." "If you'd call it a robot," muttered Arthur, "it's more of an electronic sulking machine." "Bring it," said the old man. Arthur was quite surprised to hear a tone of decision suddenly present in the old man's voice. He called to Marvin, who crawled up the slope, making a big show of being lame, which he wasn't. "On second thoughts," said the old man, "leave it here. You must come with me. Great things are afoot." He turned towards his craft, which, though no apparent signal had been given, now drifted quietly towards them through the dark. Arthur looked down at Marvin, who now made an equally big show of turning round laboriously and trudging off down into the crater again, muttering sour nothings to himself. "Come," said the old man. "Come now, or you will be late." "Late?" said Arthur. "What for?" "What is your name, human?" "Dent. Arthur Dent," said Arthur. "Late, as in the late Dent Arthur Dent," said the man sternly. "It's a sort of threat, you see." Another wistful look came into his tired old eyes.
I've never been very good at them myself, but I've been told they can be very effective." Arthur blinked at him. "What an extraordinary person," he muttered to himself. "I beg your pardon," said the old man. "Oh, nothing, I'm sorry," said Arthur in embarrassment. "All right, where do we go?" "In my air car," said the old man, motioning Arthur to get into the craft, which had settled silently next to them. "We're going deep into the bowels of the planet, where even now our race is being revived from its 5 million-year slumber. Magrathea awakes." Arthur shivered involuntarily as he seated himself next to the old man. The strangeness of it, the silent bobbing movement of the craft as it soared into the night sky, quite unsettled him. He looked at the old man, his face illuminated by the dull glow of the tiny lights on the instrument panel. "Excuse me," he said to him. "What is your name, by the way?" "My name?" said the old man, and the same distant sadness came to his face again. He paused. "My name," he said, "is Slotterbotfast." Arthur practically choked. "I beg your pardon," he sputtered. "Slotterbotfast," repeated the old man quietly. "Slotterbotfast?" The old man looked at him gravely. "I said it wasn't important," he said. The air car sailed through the night. Chapter 23. It is an important and popular fact that things are not always as they seem. For instance, on the planet Earth, man had always assumed that he was more intelligent than dolphins because he had achieved so much. The wheel, New York, wars, and so on, whilst all the dolphins had ever done was muck about in the water, having a good time. But, conversely, the dolphins had always believed that they were far more intelligent than man, for precisely the same reasons. Curiously enough, the dolphins had long known about the impending destruction of the planet Earth, and had made many attempts to alert mankind of the danger. But most of their communications were misinterpreted as amusing attempts to punch footballs or whistle for tidbits. So they eventually gave up and left the Earth by their own means shortly before the Vogons arrived. The last ever dolphin message was misinterpreted as a surprisingly sophisticated attempt to do a double backward somersault through a hoop whilst whistling the Star-Spangled Banner. But in fact, the message was this: "So long, and thanks for all the fish." In fact, there was only one species on the planet more intelligent than dolphins, and they spent a lot of their time in behavioral research laboratories, running around inside wheels and conducting frighteningly elegant and subtle experiments on man. The fact that once again man completely misinterpreted this relationship was entirely according to these creatures' plans. Chapter 24. Silently, the air car coasted through the cold darkness, a single soft glow of light that was utterly alone in the deep Magrathian night. It sped swiftly. Arthur's companion seemed sunk in his own thoughts, and when Arthur tried on a couple of occasions to engage him in conversation again, he would simply reply by asking if he was comfortable enough, and then left it at that. Arthur tried to gauge the speed at which they were traveling, but the blackness outside was absolute, and he was denied any reference points. The sense of motion was so soft and slight, he could almost believe they were hardly moving at all. Then a tiny glow of light appeared in the far distance, and within seconds had grown so much in size that Arthur realized it was traveling towards them at a colossal speed, and he tried to make out what sort of craft it might be. He peered at it, but was unable to discern any clear shape, and suddenly gasped in alarm as the aircraft dipped sharply and headed downwards in what seemed certain to be a collision course. Their relative velocity seemed unbelievable, and Arthur had hardly time to draw breath before it was all over. The next thing he was aware of was an insane silver blur that seemed to surround him. He twisted his head sharply round and saw a small black point dwindling rapidly in the distance behind them, and it took him several seconds to realize what had happened. They had plunged into a tunnel in the ground. The colossal speed had been their own relative to the glow of light, which was now a stationary hole in the ground, the mouth of the tunnel. The insane blur of silver was the circular wall of the tunnel down which they were shooting, apparently at several hundred miles an hour. He closed his eyes in terror. After a great length of time, which he made no attempt to judge, he sensed a slight subsidence in their speed, and some while later became aware that they were gradually gliding to a gentle halt. He opened his eyes again. They were still in the silver tunnel, threading and weaving their way through what appeared to be a crisscross warren of converging tunnels. When they finally stopped, it was in a small chamber of curved steel. Several tunnels also had their terminus here, and at the farthest end of the chamber, Arthur could see a large circle of dim, irritating light. It was irritating because it played tricks with the eyes. It was impossible to focus on it properly, or tell how near or far it was. Arthur guessed, quite wrongly, that it might be ultraviolet. Slatterbartfast turned and regarded Arthur with his solemn old eyes. "Earthman," he said, "we are now deep in the heart of Magrathea." "How did you know I was an Earthman?" demanded Arthur. "These things will become clear to you," said the old man gently. "At least," he added, with slight doubt in his face, "clearer than they are at the moment." He continued, "I should warn you that the chamber we are about to pass into does not literally exist within our planet. It is a little too large. We are about to pass through a gateway into a vast tract of hyperspace. It may disturb you." Arthur made nervous noises. Slatterbartfast touched a button and added, not entirely reassuringly, "It scares the willies out of me. Hold tight." The car shot forward into the circle of light, and suddenly Arthur had a fairly clear idea of what infinity looked like. It wasn't infinity, in fact. Infinity itself looks flat and uninteresting. Looking up into the night sky is looking into infinity. Distance is incomprehensible, and therefore meaningless. The chamber into which the air car emerged was anything but infinite. It was just very, very big, so that it gave the impression of infinity far better than infinity itself. Arthur's senses bobbed and span, as, travelling at the immense speed he knew the air car attained, they climbed slowly through the open air, leaving the gateway through which they had passed an invisible pinprick in the shimmering wall behind them. The wall. The wall defied the imagination, seduced it, and defeated it. The wall was so paralyzingly vast and sheer that its top, bottom, and sides passed away beyond the reach of sight. The mere shock of vertigo could kill a man. The wall appeared perfectly flat. It would take the finest laser measuring equipment to detect that as it climbed, apparently to infinity, as it dropped dizzyingly away, as it planned out to either side, it also curved. It met itself again 13 light seconds away. In other words, the wall formed the inside of a hollow sphere, a sphere over 3 million miles across and flooded with unimaginable light. "Welcome," said Slatterbartfast as the tiny speck that was the air car, travelling now at 3 times the speed of sound, crept imperceptibly forward into the mind-boggling space. "Welcome," he said, "to our factory floor." Arthur stared about him in a kind of wonderful horror. Ranged away before them, at distances he could neither judge nor even guess at, were a series of curious suspensions. Delicate traceries of metal and light hung about shadowy spherical shapes that hung in the space. "This," said Slatterbartfast, "is where we make most of our planets, you see." "You mean," said Arthur, trying to form the words, "you mean you're starting it all up again now?" No, good heavens, no," exclaimed the old man. "No, the galaxy isn't nearly rich enough to support us yet. No, we've been awakened to perform just one extraordinary commission for very special clients from another dimension. It may interest you. There, in the distance in front of us." Arthur followed the old man's finger till he was able to pick out the floating structure that he was pointing out. It was indeed the only one of the many structures that betrayed any sign of activity about it, though this was more of a subliminal impression than anything one could put one's finger on. At the moment, however, a flash of light arced through the structure and revealed in stark relief the patterns that were formed on the dark sphere within. Patterns that Arthur knew. Rough blobby shapes that were as familiar to him as the shapes of words, part of the furniture of his mind. For a few seconds he sat in stunned silence as the images rushed around his mind, and tried to find somewhere to settle down and make sense. Part of his brain told him that he knew perfectly well what he was looking at and what the shapes represented, whilst another quite sensibly refused to countenance the idea and abdicated responsibility for any further thinking in that direction. The flash came again, and this time there could be no doubt. "The Earth," whispered Arthur. "Well, the Earth Mark II, in fact," said Slatterbartfast cheerfully. "We're making a copy from our original blueprints." There was a pause.
"Are you trying to tell me," said Arthur slowly and with control, "that you originally made the Earth?" "Oh, yes," said Slaughterbartfast. "Did you ever go to a place? I think it was called Norway." "No," said Arthur. No, I didn't." "Pity," said Slaughterbartfast. "That was one of mine. Won an award, you know. Lovely crinkly edges. I was most upset to hear about its destruction." "You were upset?" "Yes. 5 minutes later, and it wouldn't have mattered so much. It was quite a shocking cock-up." "Huh?" said Arthur. "The mice were furious." "The mice were furious." "Oh, yes," said the old man mildly. "Yes, well, so I expect were the dogs and cats and duck-billed platypuses, but they hadn't paid for it, you see, had they?" "Look," said Arthur, "would it save you a lot of time if I just gave up and went mad now?" For a while the aircar flew in an awkward silence. Then the old man tried patiently to explain. "Earthman, the planet you lived on was commissioned, paid for, and run by mice. It was destroyed 5 minutes before the completion of the purpose for which it was built. And we've got to build another one." Only one word registered with Arthur. "Mice," he said. "Indeed, Earthman." "Look, sorry, are we talking about the little white furry things with the cheese fixation and women standing on tables screaming in the early 60s sitcoms?" Slaughterbartfast coughed politely. "Earthman," he said, "it is sometimes hard to follow your mode of speech. Remember, I have been asleep inside the planet of Magrathea for 5 million years, and know little of these early 60s sitcoms of which you speak. These creatures you call mice, you see, they are not quite as they appear. They are merely the protrusion into our dimension of vast, hyper-intelligent, pan-dimensional beings. The whole business with the cheese and squeaking is just a front." The old man paused, and with a sympathetic frown continued. "They've been experimenting on you, I'm afraid." Arthur thought about this for a second, and then his face cleared. No," he said. "I see the source of the misunderstanding now. No, look, you see, what happened was that we used to do experiments on them. They were often used in behavioral research, Pavlov and all that sort of stuff. So what happened was that the mice would be set on all sorts of tests, learning to ring bells, run around mazes and things, so that the whole nature of the learning process could be examined. From our observations of their behavior, we were able to learn all sorts of things about our own." Arthur's voice tailed off. "Such subtlety," said Slaughterbartfast. "One has to admire it." "What?" said Arthur. "How better to disguise their real natures, and how better to guide your thinking. Suddenly running down a maze the wrong way, eating the wrong bit of cheese, unexpectedly dropping dead of myxomatosis. If it's finely calculated, the cumulative effect is enormous." He paused for effect. "You see, Earthman, they really are particularly clever, hyper-intelligent, pan-dimensional beings. Your planet and people have formed the matrix of an organic computer running a 10 million year research program. Let me tell you the whole story. It'll take a little time." "Time," said Arthur weakly, "is not currently one of my problems." Chapter 25. There are, of course, many problems connected with life, of which some of the most popular are: why are people born? Why do people die? Why do they want to spend so much of the intervening time wearing digital watches? Many, many millions of years ago, a race of hyper-intelligent pan-dimensional beings, whose physical manifestation in their own pan-dimensional universe is not dissimilar to our own, got so fed up with the constant bickering about the meaning of life, which used to interrupt their favorite pastime of Brocchian ultra cricket, a curious game which involved suddenly hitting people for no readily apparent reason and then running away, that they decided to sit down and solve their problems once and for all. And to this end they built themselves a stupendous supercomputer, which was so amazingly intelligent that even before the databanks had been connected up, it had started from "I think therefore I am" and got as far as the existence of rice pudding and income tax before anyone managed to turn it off. It was the size of a small city. Its main console was installed in a specially designed executive office, mounted on an enormous executive desk of the finest ultra mahogany, topped with rich ultra-red leather. The dark carpeting was discreetly scrumptious,
Exotic pot plants and tastefully engraved prints of the principal computer programmers and their families were deployed liberally about the room, and stately windows looked out upon a tree-lined public square. On the day of the great on-turning, 2 soberly dressed programmers with briefcases arrived and were shown discreetly into the office. They were aware that this day they would represent their entire race in its greatest moment, but they conducted themselves calmly and quietly as they seated themselves deferentially before the desk, opened their briefcases, and took out their leather-bound notebooks. Their names were Lonkwell and Fook. For a few moments they sat in respectful silence. Then, after exchanging a quiet glance with Fook, Lonkwell leaned forward and touched a small black panel. The subtlest of hums indicated that the massive computer was now in total active mode. After a pause, it spoke to them in a voice rich, resonant, and deep. It said,
"What is this great task for which I, Deep Thought, the second greatest computer in the universe of time and space, has been called into existence?"
Lonkwell and Fook glanced at each other in surprise.
"Your task, O computer,"
began Fook.
"No, wait a minute, this isn't right,"
said Lonkwell, worried.
"We distinctly designed this computer to be the greatest one ever, and we're not making do with the second best. Deep Thought," he addressed the computer, "are you not, as we designed you to be, the greatest and most powerful computer of all time?"
"I described myself as the second greatest,"
intoned Deep Thought.
"And such I am."
Another worried look passed between the 2 programmers. Lonkwell cleared his throat.
"Well, there must be some mistake," he said. "Are you not a greater computer than the Millard Gargantubrain, which can count all the atoms in a star in a millisecond?"
"The Millard Gargantubrain,"
said Deep Thought with unconcealed contempt.
"A mere abacus. Mention it not."
"And are you not," said Fook, leaning anxiously forward, "a greater analyst than the Googleplex star thinker in the 7th galaxy of light and ingenuity, which can calculate the trajectory of every single dust particle throughout a 5-week Dangrabad beta sand blizzard?"
"A 5-week sand blizzard,"
said Deep Thought haughtily.
"You ask this of me, who has contemplated the very vectors of the atoms in the Big Bang itself? Molest me not with this pocket calculator stuff."
The 2 programmers sat in uncomfortable silence for a moment. Then Lonkwell leaned forward again.
"But are you not," he said, "a more fiendish disputant than the great hyperbolic omnicognate neutron wrangler of Ciceronicus 12, the magic and undefatigable?"
"The great hyperbolic omnicognate neutron wrangler,"
said Deep Thought, thoroughly rolling the R's.
"could talk all 4 legs off an octor and megadonkey. But only I could persuade it to go for a walk afterwards."
"Then what," asked Fook, "is the problem?"
"There is no problem,"
said Deep Thought in magnificent ringing tones.
"I am simply the second greatest computer in the universe of space and time."
"But the second?" insisted Lonkwell. "Why do you keep saying the second? You're surely not thinking of the multicorticoid perspicutron Titan Muller, are you? Or the Pondermatic, or the—"
Contemptuous lights flashed across the computer's console.
"I spare not a single unit of thought on these cybernetic simpletons," he boomed. "I speak of none but the computer that is to come after me."
Fook was losing patience. He pushed his notebook aside and muttered,
"I think this is getting needlessly messianic."
"You know nothing of future time," pronounced Deep Thought. "And yet in my teeming circuitry I can navigate the infinite delta streams of future probability and see that there must one day come a computer whose merest operational parameters I am not worthy to calculate, but which it will be my fate to eventually design."
Fook sighed heavily and glanced across to Lonkwell.
"Can we get on and ask the question?"
he asked. Lonkwell motioned for him to wait.
"What computer is this of which you speak?"
he asked.
"I will speak of it no further in this present time,"
said Deep Thought.
"Now ask what else of me you will that I may function. Speak!"
They shrugged at each other. Fook composed himself.
"O Deep Thought computer," he said, "the task we have designed you to perform is this. We want you to tell us—"
He paused.
The answer!
The answer? Said Deep Thought. The answer to what?
Life,
Urged Fook.
the universe,
Said Lonquill.
everything.
They said in chorus.
Deep Thought paused for a moment's reflection.
Tricky, he said finally.
But can you do it?
Again, a significant pause.
Yes, said Deep Thought. I can do it.
There's an answer,
Said Fook with breathless excitement.
a simple answer.
Added Lonquill.
Yes, said Deep Thought. Life, the universe, and everything. There is an answer. But, he added, I'll have to think about it.
A sudden commotion destroyed the moment. The door flew open, and two angry men wearing the coarse, faded blue robes and belts of the Cruxwim University burst into the room, thrusting aside the ineffectual flunkies who tried to bar their way.
We demand admission,
Shouted the younger of the two men, elbowing a pretty young secretary in the throat.
Come on, shouted the older one. You can't keep us out.
He pushed a janitor programmer back through the door.
We demand that you can't keep us out.
Bawled the younger one, though he was now firmly inside the room, and no further attempts were being made to stop him.
Who are you?
Said Lonquill, rising angrily from his seat.
What do you want?
I am Magicthacy,
Announced the older one.
And I demand that I am Vroomfondle.
Shouted the younger one. Magicthacy turned on Vroomfondle.
It's all right,
He explained angrily.
you don't need to demand that.
All right.
Bawled Vroomfondle, banging on a nearby desk.
I am Vroomfondle, and that is not a demand, that is a solid fact. What we demand is solid facts.
No, we don't,
Exclaimed Magicthacy in irritation.
That is precisely what we don't demand.
Scarcely pausing for breath, Vroomfondle shouted.
We don't demand solid facts. What we demand is a total absence of solid facts. I demand that I may or may not be Vroomfondle. But who the devil are you?
Exclaimed an outraged Fook.
We,
Said Magicthacy.
are philosophers.
Though we may not be.
Said Vroomfondle, waving a warning finger at the programmers.
Yes, we are, insisted Magicthacy. We are quite definitely here as representatives of the amalgamated union of philosophers, sages, luminaries, and other thinking persons, and we want this machine off, and we want it off now.
What's the problem?
Said Lonquill.
I'll tell you what the problem is, mate,
Said Magicthacy.
Demarcation, that's the problem.
We demand,
Yelled Vroomfondle.
that demarcation may or may not be the problem.
You just let the machines get on with the adding up,
Warned Magicthacy.
and we'll take care of the eternal verities, thank you very much. You want to check your legal position, you do, mate. Under law, the quest for ultimate truth is quite clearly the inalienable prerogative of your working thinkers. Any bloody machine goes and actually finds it, and we're straight out of a job, aren't we? I mean, what's the use of us sitting up half the night arguing if there may or may not be a god if this machine goes and gives us his bloody phone number the next morning?
That's right,
Shouted Vroomfondle.
we demand rigidly defined areas of doubt and uncertainty.
Suddenly, a stentorian voice boomed across the room.
Might I make an observation at this point?
Inquired Deep Thought.
We'll go on strike.
Yelled Vroomfondle.
That's right,
Agreed Magicthacy.
you'll have a national philosopher's strike on your hands.
The hum level in the room suddenly increased as several ancillary bass driver units, mounted in sedately carved and varnished cabinet speakers around the room, cut in to give Deep Thought's voice a little more power.
All I wanted to say, bellowed the computer, is that my circuits are now irrevocably committed to calculating the answer to the ultimate question of life, the universe, and everything.
He paused and satisfied himself that he now had everyone's attention, before continuing more quietly.
But the program will take me a little while to run.
Fook glanced impatiently at his watch.
How long?
He asked.
7.5 million years,
Said Deep Thought. Lonquill and Fook blinked at each other.
7.5 million years?
They cried in chorus.
Yes,
Declaimed Deep Thought.
I said I'd have to think about it, didn't I? And it occurs to me that running a program like this is bound to create an enormous amount of popular publicity for the whole area of philosophy in general. Everyone's going to have their own theories about what answer I'm eventually to come up with, and who better to capitalize on that media market than you yourself? So long as you keep disagreeing with each other violently enough and slagging each other off in the popular press, you can keep yourselves on the gravy train for life. How does that sound?"
The two philosophers gaped at him.
"Bloody hell!" said Magic the Sea. "Now that is what I call thinking. Here, Broomfondle, why do we never think of things like that?"
"Dunno," said Broomfondle in an odd whisper. "Think our brains must be too highly trained, Magic the Sea."
So saying, they turned on their heels and walked out the door, and into a lifestyle beyond their wildest dreams.